Okay. This seems to be the session with technical problems. I was intending to use my machine. The picture on my machine is rendered in a very awful way on this screen, so I'm glad to use Sid's one for my presentation on basically the EDM. This is what I'm intending to do. I'm trying to give you an idea of what this actually is and what it is not. I'm trying to show you a few examples of how we model object and context. I will be talking a bit about the way EDM is related to the linked open data paradigm. I'll say a few words on RDF, potential problems, limitations, and then to end with, I'll show you an example of an ongoing project and how we think scholars might make use of the EDM. So the EDM, where does it come from? Basically, it comes from Europeana, which was a reaction to what, back in 2005, the French perceived this way. The Google rat that was devouring European culture. So this then triggered a violent reaction by the former librarian of France, Jean-Noël Jeanneney, who was perceiving this as a challenge of Europe being challenged by Google. And this again then triggered a political reaction, which, as you all know, led to the creation of a first prototype, which was launched in 2008 and immediately crashed quite spectacularly, which was helpful in a way, by the way. But since then, this first Europeana portal has been growing and is currently up to 20 million objects being represented. Still, this is basically just another portal. Nothing really spectacular and innovative about it. It's just lots of objects represented in a model which we chose because we had to be quick. The Commission had promised something in 2005 to happen in 2008. They did not know what they were talking about, so we came up with a very simplistic solution, the so-called Europeana semantic elements, which I'm not going into in detail, which euphemistically you could call simple and robust, but basically it had lots of limitations, and probably we should never have called it semantic, because that is definitely what it was not. This is what the ESE in essence is. It is still what we all know, at least librarians among us, a typical record-based model to represent metadata. Now, right after the launch of the portal, we started working on a different model, and that's the EDM I want to talk about, which basically is another metadata model, which is currently in the course of replacing the ESE. And it's a model, to be a bit more precise, for making statements about digital representations of cultural heritage objects. That's how I would define it. It's not about the actual objects, it's about digital representations, and it's a model for making statements, potentially conflicting statements. And the second objective of the model is to enable contextualization of such representations. Contextualizations in the sense of making this part of the linked data paradigm. Now, it is not, for all the TEI people in the room, it is not an object model. It is not competing with any of the object models. It may be combined with them, but it is not a model for objects. And it is not a record model like the ones we know from the librarian environment. It is a RDF graph-based model, and that has consequences which may be interesting for our workshop here. Because basically, trying to simplify a point that has been made yesterday already, the XML models we know basically model knowledge as trees, ordered trees, with all the problems that stem from that. And the schema languages, these are using elements and types. They know this concept of validation and in a way contain a prescriptive aspect, which you do not have in RDF. RDF, graphically represented, rather looks like this, and it models knowledge as graphs, not necessarily directed graphs. And RDF has classes and properties. It has a inbuilt model of inheritance, and that way enables some kind of very simple deterministic inference, which makes all the difference, as I would see. This is something I will skip because I don't have time. There were a number of requirements and design principles, such as distinctions between object and representation, the object properties and metadata attributes, the necessity to have several perspectives of an object represented, support for composite, standard formats for metadata with specializing options and the same applying to vocabularies, and the maximum reuse of existing standards. We did that in 3 areas. We heavily draw on SCOS for knowledge organization representation. We draw on the DCMI metadata terms, which is a much richer term set than the doubling core attributes. And the one we draw on most heavily is the OAI, ORE, Object Reuse and Exchange model, which is a graph-based model for representing complex objects on the web as aggregations of web resources. All that resulted in a class model, which is deliberately simple. We only model the upper levels of what you can actually model. And the assumption is that all of these classes here can be specialized the way I'm trying to indicate with the event here, for instance. You could prune the whole CRM E5 hierarchy below that event class here. And you could make similar choices for most of the upper classes, and the same applies to the properties. This is a rather simplistic property model, and it is meant to be top level, so to enable specialization by communities. Now you get Mona Lisa again. Because this is the example we use in the primer, and we've seen it yesterday already. This is what it looks like on the web currently. This is how it looks at the French Ministry of Culture. And by the way, there is a second representation of this at the Louvre. So we need to have 2 views of this. And this is what it looks like basically in the EDM. There is a cultural heritage object, which we are referring to, which has digital representations, the thumbnails you've seen on the website, which has a proxy which binds all statements that have been made by one instance on this representation, and all this is pulled together by the aggregation node, which makes it a representation entity within Europeana. Now, using this model, you can do all sorts of things. You can do semantic enrichment. You can link, for instance, to an agent that is modeled on the web. You can work with time spans. You can link to external SCOS concepts. You can model events and things that happen in time using this model, such as, for instance, here, the event of the creation of the Mona Lisa at a given place, in a given time, or again, the event of the Mona Lisa having been stolen by François Ier. So you can model events, you can model more complex objects, you can model part-whole, hierarchical relations, order among parts of objects, or, as is in this example here, derivation and versioning relations, like here, the two editions, which then can be modeled as the one being derivative of the other. Last example, here again, a marked record in its sheer beauty, which in Gallica looks like this. This is the way it looks in the digitized environment. And this is again how it looks in the EDM. The physical thing, the proxy with all the metadata, the digital representations, and the semantic context. I use purple for things that are outside Europeana, but which we link to. And the aggregation that binds all this together. We have confirmed feasibility, viability of this model in several workshops with all the communities involved. It is already deployed at data.europeana.eu. That's our linked data pilot. Specifications and publications are available, and for the more technical people among you, there is at Europeana Labs development documentation and a related ontology. So if you want to reuse the OWL, that's possible from there. Now this brings me to the second objective of the model, which in my eyes is the more important one, which is the contextualization bit. If you take again here the core of a EDM aggregation, this can have context. The aggregation is created by an agent. The proxy may be linked to a VIAF, a SCOS, or a geonames entity. And that way, on a more higher level, you get an image of Europeana being organized on two levels. The bottom level of networked object representations that would be modeled in the EDM, and the level above, the semantic network that would be used for contextualizing these networked objects. And the user is between these two levels and free to navigate horizontally and vertically, thus creating a user experience that is radically different from librarian OPAC environments. And the charm of this is that this architecture, which we originally designed as a standalone architecture, can be plugged in this big cloud. This is the linked open data cloud that most of you will have seen in several presentations during the last months. This is the biggest contextualization resource on the world, and Europeana currently now is part of this. This was important for us, a lesson to learn, that we do not build another librarian silo, but try to be part of this bigger one. Now, if you do things this way, and this is where I link to the workshop, you get all sorts of interesting questions. To start with, a resource aggregation, where does it actually start, where does it end? Very difficult question. Or a similar question, what actually constitutes the document boundaries in such an RDF aggregation environment? I'm using colors here. That makes it intuitive. There are no colors in RDF. So you have to find some criteria to actually constitute the boundaries. Or, again, a really challenging one. Which of these nodes was connected to which other one at a given time? How to version all this is a real challenge. Or again, if you take two resources, the purple one here and the orange one here, you have context, which is directly related to them, first order links. And we would agree on this being context of these resources, but then There are other resources linked to these secondary links. Are these still part of this object's context? And if we try to version things, do we have to version this as part of the object's context? And what about all these things here that are somehow related to the secondary relations and then are shared between these two objects? Which one belongs to which and which is context of which? And then if you take this again into the time vector, how do you version all this again? Challenging. But you get new opportunities. You can do some sort of very simplistic reasoning on RDF, as you all know. If you have, for instance, this triple here, which says that La Joconde is a painting, and a second one that says that paintings are a subclass of artistic work, we can infer that La Joconde must be an artistic work. And that is possible for a machine to do. And this creates opportunities in the sense of very simple deterministic reasoning that may have some potential of enabling novel digital heuristics. Such an approach shares the pros and cons of RDF. There are pros. It's simple, it's lightweight, it avoids all the complications and heavy logic approaches of the former semantic web. It is robust, atomistic, and it seems to be scalable. But it has limitations. It has the limitations we've been talking about yesterday, namely the limitation of the triple syntax to actually express things like provenance and versioning without doing systematic reification, which the linked data people would like to avoid. So we have this discussion on the named graph we've mentioned yesterday already. And we have more complex problems, like the question I was just asking to Daniel. How do we deal with things like similarity? How do we express similarity between resources? Or again, ambiguity, because this is the most important limitation in my eyes. RDF triple syntax is definitely limited to denotative modes of signification. Anything more complex than mere denotation, A has this name, is impossible to do in RDF. And then, of course, there is this huge LOD linking resource potential, but it's dirty data. It has big quality issues, and these need to be taken into account. Now, considering all this, we have kicked off 2 weeks ago a project with this logo. This is the new logo. It's called DM2E, Digitized Manuscripts to Europeana. And you see a reference to Europeana there, of course, in the logo. You also see, at least intended, a reference to the RDF model. And this is what it basically does. It provides digitized manuscripts to Europeana. It integrates existing technical building blocks to produce a production chain that would enable migration from any kind of structured source to RDF, to the EDM, and then automated contextualization. That again was a bit Daniel was alluding to. How do you automatically create links between an object representation and semantic context? And it has a third work package that may be interesting for this community here, where we go into the way humanities research could eventually build on EDM and more RDF data, eventually generating digital heuristics and making these data as well as these heuristics available to specialized environments like the one we'll be building there, which looks a bit like this. You have to the left all sorts of structured or semi-structured data sources we can take as input, Europeana being one of them. In the middle you have a platform, a prototype of this already exists under the name of Muruka, which was developed in the Discovery project, and which basically enables digital curation workflows, which enables semantic annotation, collation, text mining, data linking, mixing, augmenting, and which basically has a potential of being used by all sorts of community, but in this work package we try to experiment it with a digital humanities community, so as to combine things like what we have here. This is a fragment of a Wittgenstein manuscript, which we can contextualize. We can say it has been created at a given date. It has a web presence, which is part of another portal. It has an author in Vaev, who is author of something else, who has been living at a place when creating this fragment. And the idea is to combine these kind of information available from the EDM together with the actual digitized objects, which are not part of Europeana, in an environment that would use ontological granular representations of what John Answorth has called scholarly primitives and what Tobias Blanke and Mark Hedges have been publishing on again last year, to actually build what I would call a social semantic scholarly graph, in which the EDM data would be extended with RDF statements. Here's just a few examples of what you could come up there. Version A is successor of version B, or scribe Y copied from scribe Z, or statement 1 on the meta level contradicts statement 2. The verbs in these sentences would be modeled ontologically, and the question actually is what we could obtain from inferencing on such a graph, what kind of scholarship this would eventually enable, and what the limitations of such an approach actually are, because we've been speculating on this for quite some time, so we would just like to do a large-scale experiment. There's some related reading, and I think I have stayed in time.
As to the quality issue, I think this is a very crucial point for the scholarly community and the linguistic community. And I wonder what approach it chose to solve this problem. Can you please dwell a little bit longer on this issue, because I think it's very simple for accepting that sort of data reform.
Well, the good news is that we do not have to solve this problem as a digital humanities community, because it's part of a bigger agenda. There is this whole linked open data community, which is quite visible in the web architecture today, and which have recognized that solving this quality problem is essential, hence all the discussions we have about our SAMAS and its use. So I would be optimistic in the sense of, if that problem cannot be solved by that larger community, we have a really big problem on the web as a whole, which we then share with the web as a whole. But the choice is to make our environment part of the generic web architecture. Well, that may be the crucial point, whether that is actually possible, because the RDF model, like so many computer science-inspired models, has a built-in semiological limitation. It's, in a way, a nominalist regression on a very high technical level. It's just about things having names. And that's why I'm unsure whether it is possible in aggregating lots of RDF statements to transcend this limitation to denotation in producing an approximation to, for instance, connotative modes of signification. No one knows, but at least I would like us to work with some consciousness of this problem. Consciousness of this problem.
Is the sort of thing you're referring to that some names as well as having denotation have a sense, Freudian sense or meaning?
Yep. I mean, in allowing contradictions and ambiguity, we may get somewhere. The question is how to deal with these on inferencing level. Because the inference machines that we have, of course, are built on non-ambiguous and non-contradicting sets of statements.
As one of the persons who probably has one of the largest varieties of source data sets, right? So you're probably in a position to actually be one of the persons who could actually evaluate the say, you know, how does the source data fit to the Europeana model? Do people abstract too much? Do people, you know, pick a low-hanging fruits, or are they too complicated and stuff like that? Do you see something like a feedback process where one could say, okay, this is how we get the data, and now to make it better, we have to go back to the providers and say, you know, so do we have an idea how this could work? Because honestly, nobody likes the pathologist who says, you know, it'd be great if you could do this and that, right? Because the answer would always be, yeah, we don't have money for that. But,
we have such a feedback mechanism built in the DM2E processing chain. The idea is that the digital humanities scholars working in the specialized environment would be able to feed back to the data providers or to those that did the automated contextualization that they have done or not done useful things. So there is a feedback loop built in the project, which is small scale. Whether we can do the same thing on Europeana level depends on whether Europeana accepts this idea of being complemented by another specialized platform that would provide functionality Europeana doesn't want to provide on portal level. We have Europeana as partner in the project, and the idea is that sustainability of this project's results would be obtained by transferring results to Europeana. So there is this perspective of growing what we do in a small-scale approach to the project to the European level as a whole. But that's the perspective.
I wonder whether there's a way in which the contents of scholarly data sets of historical materials could also serve as context. In other words, the Women Writers Project has however many documents that presumably attest to some of the information that you're trying to share. What in practical terms would be involved in using that kind of data?
That's one of the crucial technical questions. In more generic terms, it's about the coexistence of the RDF and, for instance, TEI data, and how you relate these to each other. How you point from an RDF statement to a given point in a TEI-encoded document, for instance. This is something we would like to find out. It's part of the work package. And I mean, there are RDF representations of TEI around, and this may be one of the ways to go. But this is something we would be very happy to have advice on by others. I wonder whether there have been experiments here by people in the room regarding coexistence of RDF and TEI-based models. That's one of the crucial questions.
I guess just to add to my comment, I was also wondering whether projects that use TEI internally or other markup systems internally might broadcast or expose data in an RDF form, and that might provide another kind of boundary layer.
I would be careful with the term expose. If that means replication of data, no. But if that means giving the same data a second face,
like OAI.
yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you.